Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're charting a course way out into the Western Pacific. We're focusing on Palau, that remote archipelago nation.
It's a fascinating place. Its story is just incredibly rich, so many layers of history, different influences over time.
That's exactly why we're diving in. We've really dug into the source material for this one. There's a key document, a brief history of Palau, and lots of related research.
Right.
Our goal here is to, give you the shortcut, to really unpack the journey of this unique island nation from its ancient roots right up to today and, see what makes it tick.
And there's a lot to cover. We'll touch on the geography, which is pretty unique, then peel back those historical layers, Spanish, German, Japanese, American influence.
Yeah, and how it navigated its way to independence. We'll look at the culture, the economy, the challenges it faces now.
Even some specific people who were key figures at different points.
So if you're curious about how a small nation handles everything from ancient traditions to global politics, well, stick around. Let's get into it.
Okay, so the foundation, geography. The sources really hammer home just how remote Palau is. It's the spread-out archipelago, right? Over 300 islands.
300?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Only about 8 of them are actually lived on.
Wow, that few.
And the total land area is tiny, like 490, maybe 500 square kilometers altogether.
So mostly ocean, then. What's the actual land like on those islands?
Well, the material says it generally rises towards the middle, but the highest point isn't that high, maybe 242 meters near core.
Okay.
So not much of a natural barrier against the ocean. You get these very distinct rock islands, steep cliffs, often just rising straight out of these shallow lagoons.
And water's obviously key, not just around them, but within them, too.
Absolutely. There's this underwater shelf, goes out maybe 27 kilometers around the islands. And rivers, well, only one, the Ningermed, is really navigable, and even then just for canoes.
Right. And the climate must be tropical.
Definitely tropical. Temperatures don't change much all year, stays between, say, 24 and 31 Celsius. Very comfortable.
Sounds nice, but I bet there's a catch, weather-wise.
There is. Rainfall is high. Really high. 350 to maybe 660 centimeters a year.
Yeah.
Mostly June to November.
Wow.
And the tides are significant. 2 highs, 2 lows a day, can range up to 2.5 meters. Plus, and this is the big one, Palau is right in the path of typhoons.
Oof. So beautiful, but definitely exposed. Makes you think about the first people who settled there. What do we know?
The evidence points to people arriving thousands of years ago. There's archaeology, this Calocrean culture, maybe 900 or even earlier. And what's really striking, the sources say, is that by 1696, when Europeans first showed up, the prehistoric culture already had a lot of the same traits you see in Palauan culture today.
That's incredible continuity. Can they actually date that early settlement?
Yeah, they use radiocarbon dating on sediments from old islets. One place, Oxbow, was settled about 1,000 years after it formed. Another, East Oxbow, about 500 years after. One source even calls the sediment layers a kind of tape recording of settlement.
A tape recording in the mud. Love that image. So tell us about the core of that traditional culture. Beliefs, structure.
Okay, so a really key thing was the matrilineal kinship system.
Matrilineal.
Yeah, so things like land, wealth, even government roles, they were all passed down through the female line.
Interesting.
And they had a traditional government structure, too. Different offices, councils, higher chiefs looking after public areas.
And oral tradition must have been huge for keeping all that going.
Absolutely central. At first, imaginative stories, creation myths, tales about heroes, how things came to be, sometimes simple structures.
Did that change over time?
Yeah, it got more complex, started weaving in ideas from outside, from Europeans eventually, and developed this unique Palauan style. But the downside was some older beliefs, especially about certain supernatural beings, kind of faded away.
And this culture wasn't just abstract ideas, right? The sources talk about very specific daily practices linked to the environment.
They really do. They call these practices the backbone of life. It shaped everything: fishing, planting, traveling, building. There was this deep reverence for water source of life, but also destruction.
Specific rules, you mean, not just general respect.
Exactly. The details are amazing, like near water sources, springs. You had to speak softly, keep things clean, even let the source know if a big gathering was planned nearby. Forests, too. Rules about fires, smoke, how much you could harvest. Hunting rules, specific ways to hunt pigs, not taking females or young ones. The goal was always balance.
And the ocean, the reefs, Same deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Detailed rules for refishing, like you fish one spot, then you move. If you found an animal already dead, you'd leave a certain snail. Traps on the reef had to be marked, covered so things didn't get caught by accident. It was all about maintaining that harmony.
It really shows how intertwined culture and nature were. Are there actual places, sites, that still embody this history?
Oh, yes. Cultural heritage sites are vital. Stone woods were rebuilt to review history, and Gardmau Waterfall is mentioned as just majestic. And the community meeting houses, they're seen as the prides of Palauan history.
I remember reading a really vivid story in the sources about a stone trough connected to these meeting houses.
Yes, it's quite the tale. Ancestors supposedly brought the sacred stone trough, put it in a traditional meeting house, a moot. But the maiden in charge was, well, careless apparently.
Got it.
A white cockatoo landed on the trough, and somehow its droppings caused the whole house to catch fire. Big blaze. But they studiously saved the stone trough, threw it in the water, only the tip showed.
Wow. And the story connects to Christianity arriving later.
It does. When Christianity came, the moot was condemned as idol worship. Palauans were told to tear it down, but 14 ladies knelt outside praying the next day. An earthquake apparently sank the moot,
Wow.
and only 3 stones were left visible. These became linked to 3 cursed maidens in the story. So it connects the old ways, the new beliefs, this dramatic event. The stone meeting house that's there now was built much later, 1902.
What a mix of myth, history, and cultural shift. There was also mention of a huge stone wall.
Yes, a gigantic stone wall. It fenced in these stone woods on Ngurunga Sarklia interior, cast a massive shadow. It supposedly held boar and even marine beings at one point. And the sources note the sheer effort involved patting, scraping, oiling the stone and wood, destroying lots of wood just to build it. Gives you a sense of the scale of their traditional projects.
Incredible. Okay, let's shift gears. This deep traditional life eventually encountered the outside world. Centuries of external influence started.
Yeah, and this is where Palau's story gets really layered and complex. Spanish explorers were probably the first Europeans, maybe early 1500s, but Spain didn't really start formal exploration until 1696.
Did they claim it right away?
They claimed it, yeah. Called it the Sandwich Islands in 1783, weirdly enough, but they didn't really establish solid control then.
Others came too. British, Americans.
Definitely. The British called it the Palau Islands, and between about 1815 and 1849, lots of European and American ships stopped by. Whalers, traders, explorers. They were gathering info, adding it to maps.
Did Spain try to make a bigger play later on?
They did. Starting around 1862, they tried evangelizing, bringing Christianity, but they also used repressive tactics against the local population who mostly resisted.
How did that resistance play out?
Well, things got tense. Palauans executed some missionaries in 1885. Spain sent punitive expeditions destroying villages, deporting people, even set up a prison colony on Engar.
Sounds harsh. Was it effective for Spain?
Not really, according to the sources. The actions were maybe too few to really control the islands, but also too severe to result in effective governance. Spain had seen Palau as strategic much earlier, like back in 1565, as a stopover for routes to the Philippines and Guam. They mapped it early, but kind of ignored it for centuries. Stronger colonization attempts only came much later.
So Spain's grip was never really that strong. And then came the Germans.
Exactly. After the Spanish-American War, Spain's influence ended. In 1899, Spain formally sold Palau to Germany, though one source mentions Germany acquiring it maybe as early as 1886 after Spain held it for 300 years. So a slight wobble on the exact date in the sources, but definitely German control by the turn of the century.
And Germany folded it into its colonial empire?
Yep. Administered it as part of German New Guinea or Nova Pomerania. German companies saw some economic potential. They even tried to encourage German settlers, saying the climate was like Queensland.
How did German rule actually affect Palau? Was it a big transformation?
The sources describe the political situation under Germany as turbid, a bit murky, and they suggest German disinterestedness and indifference meant they kind of squandered opportunities. Hopes for a big German colony there were vain, no gold, no valuable mines found.
So not a top priority for Germany.
Yeah, apparently not. Babeldube, the biggest island, was seen as having little value commercially. But there were changes, definitely. Between 1899 and 1914, they expanded plantations, improved the transport network a bit, though smaller islands stayed undeveloped.
What about the economy?
The copra industry became important. Infrastructure saw some improvements, government control increased. And you did see European and Chinese settlers arriving, making the population, especially in Koror, more diverse and bigger. Anthropological studies also kicked off around 1903.
Okay, so a period of some development, but maybe not intense focus. And it was a relatively short period before the next big power shift.
Very short. World War I changed everything. Japan seized Palau from Germany very early in the war, March 1914, and they held it right through until 1944.
So Japan gets control. What did that mean for Palau?
Well, after WWI, Japan got an official mandate over the islands from the League of Nations around 1919 or 1920. It became part of their South Seas mandate.
And how did Japanese occupation change things on the ground?
Big changes. Japanese government and companies moved in. Sugar planting, tuna canning, those became major industries. But the global depression in the 1930s hit hard, apparently led to hunger, and Japan's focus shifted more and more towards the military, preparing for war. The sources mention Palau being continuously attacked as different powers vied for control.
Building up to World War II, then.
Exactly. There's a note about a U.S. trade ban on Japan in 1939, forcing compliance through what a source calls unrepresented political altruism. Kind of an odd phrase.
Yeah.
And Palau was directly involved in the wider war, linked to Pearl Harbor in December 41. Fighting spread across the Pacific, including the Western Carolines, where Palau is. There was a major Japanese military action there early in 1944, the southward invasion.
The sources use some really striking language about the war's impact there, don't they?
They do talk of a titanic air raid by Japan with huge bombers. Equipment from that is apparently still found there. In 1944, Palau was used as an outwork of attack in major battles.
And that strange reference. Something about a MUM air raid.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It compares it to Tokyo and Osaka, talks about unexplained locations under the moon and ocean found with NASA tech, and the source flat out says, no one knows this perplexing history in Palau.
A genuine mystery right there in the historical record.
Okay.
So, beyond the military side, what was the overall effect of Japanese rule?
It fundamentally reshaped Palau. Lots of Japanese settlers came. This led to overhunting, commercial processing of things like turtles and fish. Forests and reefs suffered extensive lasting damage.
And culturally?
Education was introduced, but it was heavily focused on Japanese language, culture, ideology, big construction boom, lots of military spending, building fortifications against the U.S. Palau really became a front line in the Pacific War.
Which brings us straight into World War II itself and then the post-war period under U.S. influence.
Right. As part of that Japanese mandate, Palau was a major target for the U.S. after things like Pearl Harbor and Guam. In June 1943, the U.S. apparently sent this huge fleet towards Palau, like 600 ships. The sources even call it possibly the largest invasion force ever.
And the fighting on the islands themselves must have been brutal.
Incredibly intense. The battle for Palau, starting September 44, though one source mentions U.S. landings in March 45, so maybe different phases involve some of the bitterest fighting of the war. And the sources note that younger Palauan men, women, even children actively fought with the Americans. They wanted freedom from Japanese rule. The last Japanese holdout surrendered around June or August 1945 again. Slight date variations in the material.
What did all that fighting leave behind?
Physically, just devastation. Heavy U.S. bombing and shelling left caves, villages battered and ruined. Wrecked Japanese ships, equipment, debris still litter the mangroves and lagoons. Caused damage then, probably still does. Geological features used for cover were bombed into sandy rubble.
The descriptions of the remnants are pretty stark.
They really paint a picture. Beaches dotted with sunken ships, heavy artillery, and damaged burials. Uninhabited islands just covered in leftover military junk shells, drums, vehicle wrecks, cans.
And dangerous stuff, too.
Critically, yes. The sources emphasize. Many live bombs lay around in the grass and lagoon areas of all types and calibers, still a threat today. And on heavily bombed islands, the forests were just reduced to the ground entirely.
A really deep, lasting scar. So after 1945, a new chapter begins under the U.S. as a UN trust territory.
That's right. Palau became part of the UN trust territory of the Pacific Islands, but effectively under U.S. control until 1994. The U.S. Navy initially set up a military government.
Sounds kind of makeshift at first.
It does. The sources mention an officer working from a tent on the beach initially. Eventually, civil government was reestablished, still under the Navy, until the formal UN trust agreement in late 1947.
What were the early days of that administration like? Any major hurdles?
A big one was lack of money. Appropriations, the sources call it. This really hampered setting up proper government structures, schools, just basic operations. Plans to involve Palauan advisors got dropped. Regulations took time. At one point, the U.S. Army Transport Service even ran things briefly.
So Palauan involvement wasn't immediate. When did that change?
It started gradually. Admin went back to the Navy, though an Army garrison stayed. The sources say key jobs, island administrator, education head, public health, eventually went to Palauans, seen as a sign of confidence.
But tensions still arose.
Yes, removing Japanese settlers while bringing in U.S. advisors apparently led to a breakdown in relations sometimes.
And this seems to be when Palauan political identity started to really emerge more strongly.
Definitely. You had elected representatives starting to voice grievances, ambitions for the future. Local industry was growing, pushing the need for a sustainable economy. And when the U.S. pushed for Palau to join a federation with other Micronesian islands, the Palauan legislature responded with this loyalty oath to the U.S.
But that oath wasn't straightforward support for the U.S.
No, the sources call it ambiguous. It cleverly allowed leaders to argue for either full independence or becoming a U.S. state. So political maneuvering was happening. Development programs went ahead. But by the 1970s, you see real frustration growing and a clear independence movement taking shape.
And this was happening across Micronesia under the Trust Territory System, right?
Exactly. The sources frame it as Micronesia moving from old colonial powers to being surrendered to new masters under the U.S. treaty, becoming a trust territory through a highly contested process. It was marked by constant friction, political, legal, diplomatic, between the U.S. and the islands.
The road to self-government sounds like a long, difficult negotiation.
It really was. A big step was the 1969 Micronesian Constitutional Convention with UN observers. That kicked off a 17-year transition. U.S. control was initially seen as pretty solid. The Compact of Free Association deal that was eventually proposed faced criticism too.
Why was it criticized?
Some saw it as just U.S. imperialism in a new guise, pointing to conditions about letting the U.S. keep military installations. There were even concerns mentioned about spying a U.S. military satellite station on Palau potentially being used to monitor political movements elsewhere.
Wow. So complex talks.
Very. Took years. Involved everyone from U.S. officials to island leaders, even exiles. And Palau ended up being the last piece of the trust territory puzzle.
The last one.
Yeah. FSM and the Marshall Islands ended their trusteeship in May 1986. Palau remained under it until '94. And the sources point out that even after all that process, big issues like compensation for war damages or environmental cleanup remain unresolved. Apparently, neither side presently seems interested in addressing them.
Okay, so let's zero in on Palau's specific path to independence during that time. Its isolation was a factor.
The sources suggest being largely in isolation kind of forced Palau to figure out its future in 1967. They held a constitutional convention, set up a democratic system, a Bill of Rights, drafted a compact of free association with the U.S., waiting for UN approval.
So the Constitution was a major milestone.
Huge. It became effective January 1st, 1981. There was this strong desire for more control, maybe even driven by concerns about preventing Japanese rearmament again. That led to a vote in '83 to negotiate a new compact with the U.S.
Did the U.S. try to shape that compact?
It seems so. The sources mention a U.S. attempt to pass it with certain qualifications failed at first. A final version was eventually approved in a referendum.
And that compact led to full independence.
Yes. It became effective October 1st, 1994, when Palau officially became the Republic of Palau. And it was significant because it limited U.S. interference. Palau could basically say no to the U.S. on foreign relations, defense, security.
Since '94, how has Palau dealt with the legacy of all that history, particularly with the U.S. and Japan?
It's complicated. Some Palauans just wanted to move on, draw a line under the past. Others, described as choosing partial retraction, wanted apologies, especially regarding how Palau apparently gave with nuclear testing nearby in the past.
And the U.S. relationship continues to evolve. Negotiations are ongoing.
Yes, a proposed new compact is still being worked on. The sources say this could really change the pace of development again, good and bad. Palau's location is still strategically vital, attracting interest from rivals.
There was that striking quote in the material.
Yes, about a potential future military-based treaty risking the unwanted attentions of superficial Australia.
Superficial Australia. That really jumps out. Shows the sensitivity, maybe some specific viewpoints within Palau about outside powers.
It certainly highlights the complexities. There's also been displeasure, protests about the U.S. using Palauan waters for live ammo tests. The big challenge noted is how Palau can survive the transition from remoteness, which shielded it somewhat while still protecting itself from these pressures.
And the whole question of whether independence was even viable must have been huge during the Constitution drafting.
Absolutely. It was a major focus early on. As things became more locally governed, society started to resemble democracy. But the sources caution practice didn't always match theory, especially on things like freedom of assembly or the press. The back and forth between the U.S. Congress and Paulian legislature showed those tensions. Even the 1980 draft Constitution, while locally influenced, revealed cultural conflicts. A lot wasn't fully sorted until that 1994 Free Association.
Okay, so after that whole incredibly complex journey, we arrive the independent Republic of Palau. What's the government setup now?
It's a sovereign nation, a democratic republic. The structure comes from their constitution, drafted 79, ratified 80, amended 86. It's unitary, multi-party presidential system. 3 branches, like the U.S. model.
Executive, legislative, judicial.
Exactly. Executive. President and VP elected for 4 years. President heads the government, commander-in-chief appoints the cabinet. Legislative, that's National Congress, or Ulbil era Kilulau. It's bicameral.
2 houses.
Yep. A Senate with 13 members and a House of Delegates with 16. Both serve 4-year terms. The Senate also acts as the court for impeachments.
And a judicial branch.
Power lies with the Supreme Court, plus lower courts. They handle criminal, civil cases. Justices are appointed by the president, need Senate consent, serve 8-year terms.
What about the traditional leaders? Do they still have a voice in this modern system?
They do. The sources say they have an advisory role, kind of like an upper house or council of chiefs. Each of the 16 states in Palau also has its own traditional council, which is advisory too, like a local senate. Plus, local mayors are elected.
How's this democracy working in practice since '94?
The material suggests it's been a stable and flourishing democracy. It specifically highlights full gender equality and women being active in government and public life. There's technically one political party on record, but it doesn't have an official role.
And internationally.
Palau's active, member of the UN, regional groups, and notably established diplomatic ties with China in September 2004. Plans mention cooperation in trade, culture, education, even sending Palauan students to China for trade learning.
Interesting. Okay, let's switch to the economy. How did it evolve from the traditional barter system?
Well, the cash economy really kicked off with resource extraction phosphate coral. Spain was exporting phosphate way back in the early 1900s. Coconuts, copra became big later. Agriculture was huge pre-WWI, like over 90% of cash income.
But not anymore.
No, today it's tiny, less than 10% of the cash economy. The big story now is tourism. It's surged. Sources mention over 48% earnings increase at one point. It's vital.
What about other sectors? Quarrying, fishing.
Quarrying and coral export were important after WWII, but tourism dwarfs them now. Fishing is still significant, though, maybe 8% of GDP.
That shift from barter to cash must have been a huge cultural change.
Massive. Came with westernization, colonization. Wage labor started after WWII. The Japanese introduced a currency, the Kamino yen, in '51, which really pushed cash use. American checks started circulating. Banking began in '46. There's a mention of a credit union starting, which apparently accelerated repayment troubles for wage labor among women. An interesting side effect noted in the sources.
So tourism dominates the modern economy. But do traditional ways still influence work?
The sources strongly suggest they do. Even with paid jobs and cash, traditional culture and subsistence practices still shape how people think about work. There's even a hint that some modern jobs, especially maybe physical labor linked to globalization, aren't always seen or valued as work within that cultural context.
Fascinating tension. What about social services? Healthcare, for example.
It's a unified system, public and private providers. Basic services are free, but there's no social insurance like in some countries. People rely a lot on patronage, gifts, and goodwill, alongside cash.
Has access improved?
Primary care access got better after the early 90s, yeah. But there are problems. The Ministry of Health apparently struggles to pay providers sometimes, which undermines the whole system.
So reliability is an issue.
Can be. Clinics might close after hours. The ministry might even advise using traditional medicine. Referrals to bigger hospitals can be disrupted. Payment disputes sometimes lead to private providers stopping work, raising fears about people being denied care.
Are there proposed solutions?
Suggestions include the ministry regulating private fees better, improving access, though that's tricky with foreign providers. The focus is on strengthening primary care, health info systems, training staff, outreach teams for remote areas.
It sounds critical.
The sources warn that if these aren't fixed, Palau risks failing the Health for All goal, especially for a nation aiming to be aid-free. And there's a clear rural-urban divide. Rural areas lack facilities, transport is costly, almost half of sick kids might go untreated. Traditional medicine knowledge exists rurally, but it's fading as Western ways take over.
A tough balancing act. How about education?
The Republic of Palau High School in Gromwood gets mentioned as prestigious. The education department started back in '47, aiming for free, compulsory schooling. First, English-speaking admin schools, then elementary schools.
What's the structure like now?
Typically, kids start primary around age 5 for 6 years, then 4 years of high school. They teach in both Palauan and English. But science and math, only in English.
Is there concern about the Palauan language?
Yes, only 1 or 2 periods a week in high school are dedicated to it. There's concern about fluency, though some older students apparently seek out extra study voluntarily. Higher grades get priority for resources.
Are there other educational options?
Yeah, community colleges offer high school equivalency, even out in places like Kayongal and Palau, and the sources suggest maybe kindergarten is needed.
Where did the push for modern education come from initially?
Post-WWII U.S. military policy seems key. It laid the foundation for Palauans to get involved in modern business and government, things the sources say the old culture had no previous preparation for. Missionaries in the mid-19th century also emphasized church and early schools.
So English is emphasized right from the start.
Seems so. Sources state kids must learn English from kindergarten, and school is considered a priority. And it's seen as beneficial. Graduates show progressive advancement, helping both the government and the general population.
Okay, let's bring it toward the present. What are the major challenges Palau is grappling with today?
Environmentally, quite a few serious ones. Freshwater pollution is maybe top of the list. It's a limited resource. Aquifers are threatened by things like cement pits, untreated wastewater. And enforcing the environmental laws, that's noted as a problem.
Other environmental issues.
Invasive species, land degradation, and big pressure on the marine environment.
How so?
Overfishing, ignoring sustainable limits. The live reef fish trade is described as being in free fall. Tuna stocks in extreme crisis. Illegal turtle harvesting. National fishing licenses are often ignored.
That sounds bad economically, too.
Hugely. The estimated loss from illegal fishing dwarfs what the government makes from licenses. And patrolling those vast waters, especially beyond their territory, is incredibly difficult. The call is for better science, precautionary policies, and really relying on local knowledge and community action for conservation.
What about challenges on the social and economic front?
Well, the traditional matrilineal system doesn't have formal leadership roles or a middle class in the Western sense. Some villages are still very traditional, subsistence-based, but young people are leaving. Adults often seek work in Kor, the main town, or even move to the U.S.
So that classic tension between tradition and modern opportunity.
Absolutely. The sources call it a juxtaposition of globally imposed and locally constructed economic and political realities. Family structures are mostly intact, but definitely changing. And national identity, who belongs, who owns resources, can sometimes marginalize non-Palauans, even though people interact daily.
And individual desires get caught up in this.
Totally. People want English, tech skills, education, jobs, status. These desires are inspired, assisted by global connections, but also diffused, thwarted by local realities and expectations. Even being relatively close to Guam, isolation historically meant few jobs, though foreign investment is changing that slowly. But basic survival skills are still relevant. Making food, shelter, even obtaining water by hiking and carrying it back, understanding the ecosystem that's still part of life for many.
Looking ahead then, what do the sources suggest about the future for Palauans?
Migration. Migration paths, especially to Australia under U.S. contracts, seem relatively established for now. But details who goes, when, the conditions are likely up for ongoing negotiation. Australia became a bigger destination after limits on migrating to Hawaii, often for jobs like fish harvesting, processing under specific contracts.
So moving abroad is likely to continue shaping Palau's future.
It looks that way. People have ways to cope. But success depends on negotiating good travel and exit terms. Earlier generations dealt with fitting into the region. Today's migrants are actively trying to build a projected future somewhere else. The rate of moving on might slow down eventually. There's even a cryptic reference to a Palauan modification of Oshkosh starting. And leaving places like Hawaii or Australia apparently feels different from earlier migration experiences.
We mentioned notable figures briefly earlier. How do they exemplify Palauans dealing with all these external forces?
They really put a human face on it. Like Concession described in the sources, quite intriguingly, as a courtier of the late British crown, somehow involved in brokering the birth of the Palau kingship in 1783, maybe by setting up a royal line via the Spanish. It's a complex, maybe even contested origin story presented there.
Fascinatingly specific and maybe debatable detail from the source.
Exactly, or Dionisio A. Sortio, Sr. He was a former senator noted for strongly opposing the Commonwealth proposal back in 1988. His view was presented as a minority opinion since the people ultimately chose the compact. There's even a story about a flight failing to take off linked to his efforts. These figures show Palauans actively shaping their destiny amidst huge external pressures.
It really has been a remarkable deep dive, pulling all this from the sources on Palau's history and its present.
It really has. It just highlights the incredible resilience of this nation, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
From this unique ancient culture through all those layers of colonial rule, Spanish, German, Japanese, American, the sheer destruction of World War II, then the Trust Territory period.
To finally achieving self-governance, becoming an independent republic in '94. It's quite a path.
To immense strength, adaptability, negotiation.
And that balancing act continues today, right? Tradition versus modern challenges.
Yeah.
Protecting that unique, vital environment, managing the economy, tourism, navigating those tricky international relations, especially given where they are.
Exactly.
Looking into Palau's story this way, it really offers insights that go beyond just Palau. It speaks to how any small nation, any distinct culture, tries to hold on to its identity while dealing with massive global forces, grappling with history's weight, and trying to find its way forward.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, drawn straight from our material. Think about that constant tension we saw described, that pull between wanting modernization, English, technology, good jobs, maybe migrating for opportunity, and how those very aspirations are both helped and hindered by the deep-rooted local realities, the traditional structures, the expectations of Palauan life itself.
A really powerful dynamic. A reminder that even as the world gets smaller, the unique character of place, of culture, continues to profoundly shape how people and nations navigate their journey.